Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor, and on this channel we talk about life and relationships after leaving the church and do some commentary on the goings-on in evangelical Christianity. As you guys are aware, I grew up as a missionary kid in Papua, Indonesia. In high school, I attended a small Christian international school, mostly comprised of other missionary kids. Every year, my entire high school would go on this 2-week service-oriented field trip to an interior village in Papua. The supposed goal of the trip was to support the indigenous people by building up their infrastructure and providing educational resources. We mostly did things like painting buildings and putting on VBS-style Bible studies for the local children. I'm sure this field trip sounds unproblematic so far. I mean, what could be harmful about painting buildings? Well, on this 2-week trip, we also did things like educate the locals about HIV/AIDS through abstinence-only sex education. A few taglines of our HIV/AIDS educational campaign included phrases like sex bebas no, which means say no to casual sex, and tetap setia setelah menikah, which means remain faithful after marriage. And you'll have to excuse me for any of the Indonesian speakers that are currently watching this video. I haven't lived in Indonesia for almost 10 years, or over 10 years now, so my Indonesian's like not that great anymore. I should note that this ineffective and puritanical education was interwoven with actual legitimate education, like the importance of using clean needles or going to the hospital when sick. But this doesn't make up for the fact that as missionary kids, we spread harmful advice to some of the most isolated and marginalized communities in the world. Sometimes a missionary dentist would tag along on these field trips, and students, including myself, would often assist him with dental procedures on the locals. And when I say assist, I don't mean that we'd write down a patient's information or hand the dentist medical instruments. I mean, we did do those things, but we also manipulated dental instruments ourselves, administering local anesthetic or even pulling teeth with the dentist's guidance. Oh gosh, can you imagine having a rotten tooth that desperately needs to be pulled, but only having access to dental care when the Western missionaries randomly decide to come to your village? And then you have a 15-year-old girl with no experience performing the procedure. I mean, ugh. I must admit that I was fond of assisting the dentist during these procedures because as a teenager, I really had an interest in all things medical. I even learned how to do stitches by practicing on a slab of pig meat, something that my now plant-based self really cringes over. I also must admit that I enjoyed feeling like I was making a difference and saving someone from their pain. I probably had a bit of white savior complex. However, reflecting on this as an adult, I realized that my desire to help pull teeth was primarily out of self-interest and was facilitated under the guise of helping the locals. As a teenager without any experience or qualifications, I had no business performing these procedures. And this is certainly something that wouldn't be allowed to happen in the US. As a child, I didn't have the critical thinking skills required to understand the risks of what I was doing. So why did the adults in this situation allow this to happen? Well, truth be told, I think some of the adults in this situation were just as much clouded by their desire to be saviors. Before we continue with the video, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Aura. These days, it's easier than ever to find information online that most would prefer to keep private. Recently, it was reported that hackers stole over 2.9 billion personal records from a brokerage firm called National Public Data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others who perform background checks. These stolen records included full names, addresses, dates of birth, social security numbers, and phone numbers, along with alternate names and birth dates. And members of this hacker group have reportedly released this information for free online. If you haven't been really taking any precautions with your personal information online, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. It makes me pretty nervous knowing that my data is just floating around out there and that anyone could access my private information, like my social security number, to access things like my bank account or credit cards. Luckily, because I use Aura, I don't need to worry about this. Aura alerts me if they find my phone number, email, or social security number on the dark web. They'll let me know fast if anyone tries to use this information to access my credit or bank accounts. And they provide me with $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst happen. They also have a bunch of other features that keep you safe online, all inside one app. You can go to my link, aura.com/antibot, to try out Aura for free for 14 days. That's more than enough time for Aura to find out if your data is exposed. I highly recommend you do this soon because National Public Data isn't doing anything about the leaked records, and they'll probably not face any repercussions. I don't want to be vulnerable to future data breaches, and if you don't want to be either, you can go to aura.com/antibot to try them out for 2 weeks free of charge. Thank you so much, Aura. Now back to the video. Something I haven't told you about these dental procedures is that we, led by the dentist, often use this as an opportunity to evangelize. After taking down their information and getting them situated in the dentist chair, the dentist would ask the patient, "Have you accepted Jesus into your heart?" From what I remember, this was done before performing the medical procedure they desperately needed. So not only were these poor people getting their teeth pulled by a child, but they were also having to put up with an attempt to convert them to Christianity before they could receive their necessary care. To be fair, I wholeheartedly believe that if a patient said they hadn't asked Jesus into their heart or that they didn't want to, which to my knowledge never happened, we would have still helped them. But this doesn't take away from the fact that we effectively targeted people while they were vulnerable. For all these people knew, a proclamation of faith in the Christian God was required to get their teeth pulled. This was abhorrent behavior on our part. It makes me wonder if this was done solely to help the locals, or was this more about us as missionaries feeling like we're the saviors of both physical bodies and souls? Did we have, as the kids say, main character syndrome? I mean, after all, many missionaries came to this historically and currently colonized land carrying the assumption that only Protestant evangelical missionaries have the solutions to the perceived plight of the indigenous people. How is that anything other than main character syndrome? Now, I'm sure if you're watching this and you're from my former mission community, you're already preparing your objections. You're probably thinking, but not all missionaries place themselves above the locals this way or try to push their faith onto them. You were there, you know this. While I agree that not all missionaries do these things, it doesn't take away from the fact that many do. Even for those missionaries who are not actively evangelizing and instead adopt a lead by example model, believing that your group has salvific knowledge that others don't and that it's your responsibility to convert others to your ideology is still pretty self-congratulatory in my opinion. I get that it's not a great feeling to have something that many of you missionaries who are maybe listening to this dedicated your lives to and have, to a certain extent, made sacrifices for, called into question. I don't think that everything missionaries do is harmful, and some mission work is valuable. However, it's hard to not see most missionary work as an extension of colonialism when many missionaries do actively proselytize on behalf of their westernized version of Christianity, and in effect are complicit in the erasure of indigenous culture and beliefs. But here's the thing, I feel like I have a moral obligation to call this into question. If you've spent time inside a missionary community like mine, you'll know that we're not great at calling out our own harmful behavior. Since most missionary work takes place in developing countries without much, if any, regulatory oversight, scandals involving missionaries are often swept under the rug. I know of more than one missionary from my own community who's committed actual crimes and hasn't faced any legal repercussions. In fact, one of these missionaries is even working as a missionary again in a different country. Unfortunately, it does take pushing back on the status quo to make any tangible social progress. I don't want to be calling this stuff out, but maybe if evangelicals were better at holding each other accountable, it wouldn't take those outside of evangelicalism, including me, a self-described Satanist, speaking out to make these issues somewhat visible. So recently I was scrolling through Facebook, and I know good old Zuck has decided to allow bullying of queer and trans folks on the platform, so I'm not really sure if I'm going to keep my Facebook account. But anyways, I was scrolling through Facebook and I happened upon a post about an upcoming documentary about the life and work of a certain Christian missionary. Who's the missionary, you ask? Well, it's the same missionary who evangelized to patients before allowing children to poke their gums with needles. According to the documentary's trailer, the film aims to showcase the missionary and his wife's difficult journey to get to Papua and their current missionary work. The trailer starts with the missionary dentist saying that God told him to go to Papua to care for God's Papuan children, and ends with him saying, "Sometimes I'm amazed that God can use someone like me." I want to be clear that this video isn't intended to be a hit piece on this particular missionary dentist, so I'm not naming them or their upcoming documentary. I'm sure they made sacrifices to become missionaries, and I know that they've endured many hardships, just as everyone does. And this isn't an attempt on my part to claim otherwise. I also know that they've helped people through their dentistry, even if I strongly disapprove of how they've gone about it. That being said, whether or not this is their intention, I can't ignore the inherent self-aggrandizement of taking part in a documentary that paints you and your God as the saviors of indigenous people. I can't help but feel that the local people's history, culture, and experience have been effectively sidelined to make way for the hero story of a foreign missionary. What happened following the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 5:6? And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. If you watched my video, Evangelicals, Wicked, and the Death of Media Literacy, you'll know I recently sat down and recorded an interview with my best friend, Sadam. I've known Sadam for over 15 years now. This is something that we discovered through our conversation because we were trying to figure out how long we've known each other, and it's been over 15 years. She and I actually attended the same international school in Papua. Sadam loves Wicked, is very knowledgeable about musical theater, and is a talented singer and performer, so I thought that she was the obvious person to talk about the cultural relevance of the recent Wicked movie. But unless you're one of my patrons who got access to the full interview, you might not know that Sadam and I talked about a lot more than just Wicked. We actually spent almost an hour discussing our mixed feelings about our old mission community. Sadam now identifies as a deconstructing progressive Christian with a nuanced perspective of mission work. During our conversation, I shared with Sadam a depressing realization I recently had, which I'll now share with all of you. In my opinion, growing up in the mission community that I grew up in, I do feel like the local culture isn't respected. There's kind of this idea that we need to change their culture, adapt their culture to what we believe and our Western culture, and kind of stamp out what they've already had. Because Drew and I were talking about this the other day in the car, because I realized I was thinking about all the different tribes in Papua and all the different local spiritualities that probably existed and do still exist to a certain extent, and how I was never taught at any point like what like local Papuan myths or like
No.
stories that they had, like spirit, and I
Yeah.
never taught about like their spirituality. Like all I feel like I ever knew was like, oh, they had, most of them were had like a form of animism. Like I feel like that's the only thing I was ever told. And I just feel like that's so sad. Like I lived, 8 years of my life in that culture and wasn't ever taught or didn't on my own take the initiative to find out what the like local spiritualities were before like the missionaries came in. Because I mean now Papua's like, what do they say, like 50% Christian and 50% Muslim. And ever since the
Yeah.
arrival of missionaries, pretty much all of the like local spiritualities don't really exist anymore. is what I see.
Yeah, no, 100%. In fact, I find it, as you're talking about that, I actually find it interesting that I learned more about that from the company that my parents are employed by, currently still in Papua, than I actually ever did from actually being way more closer in proximity to those groups when I was at in high school. Like I find that quite fascinating
Wow.
because like I was thinking about that. I was like, I don't really know. And like in our house, not just in Ghana but also in Indonesia, we have a lot of like Papuan like art in our house. We very much love all of that sort of parts of their culture, and we respect that as well too. Like because I guess as Africans, we also have that that element of our culture, and we want to preserve that as much as we possibly can.
So recently, I started reading about the history of Christianity in Papua. I wanted to know why I never learned about the religious beliefs of the Papuans before the arrival of missionaries. And I also wanted to know why information about Papuan traditions and myths is still so difficult to find. Through my reading, I realized that my lack of knowledge of traditional Papuan spirituality and religion was partly due to the direct actions of the first missionaries who evangelized in the region. In other words, the burying or hiding away of Papuan religious tradition is a feature, not a bug, of the modus operandi of late 19th century and early 20th century foreign mission organizations. According to A History of Christianity in Indonesia, which is a lengthy volume containing the work of 26 European and Indonesian scholars, missionary work in Papua was pretty scant until about the mid-19th century. There was likely some limited Christian influence before this time as missionaries worked in the surrounding area. For example, when one Dutch missionary started working in Papua in the 1930s, he discovered a Papuan shaman using a Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas as a tool for divination. It is also likely that this limited influence contributed to the transformation of local myths. The people groups of Biak, Raja Ampat, and large parts of Cendrawasih Bay have myths about a self-sacrificing savior who left or died, but promised to return to establish a new millennium. By the mid-19th century, mission work really ramped up in Papua. One reason that Papua was chosen as a mission field, even when other parts of the world were still unreached by Christian evangelists, is because, according to the Bible, Jesus promised to return after the gospel was taken to the ends of the earth. Papua was, and to a certain extent still is, one of the most remote locations in the world, and missionaries felt like the island fit the description of ends of the earth. So, mission work in this part of the world was partly an effort to bring about the biblical end times. According to modern-day Christian Papuans, the gospel officially entered Papua when two Protestant missionaries, Karl Otto and Johann Geisler, arrived on the island of Mansinam near Manokwari on February 5th, 1855. It's said that on this day, day, the men knelt on the beach and prayed, claiming the entire island for Christ. And this day is now a public holiday in this province of Papua. At this time, and in my opinion, still somewhat to this day, the missionaries taught the Papuans that their indigenous religions were dominated by fear of ancestral spirits and secret powers that only Jesus Christ could liberate them from. From a history of Christianity in Indonesia, the missionaries, generally speaking, had a low view of the Papuans and their traditional religion. The Papuans were considered degenerate. They were considered as having only nebulous ideas, while their energy was seen as limited. The missionaries were not aware of the existence of a class of priests who would keep the old traditions. Also, intellectually, they saw the Papuans as being at a low level. They said that their main occupation was feasting and once more feasting. I mean, had they been to a bakar batu, like, if you've been to one of those, you would want to feast all the time too. When the Dutch colonial government established 2 posts in Papua in 1898, the missionaries there at the time apparently welcomed the colonial power's presence, saying that it ushered in the destruction of a pillar of paganism, aka the destruction of Papuan traditions, beliefs, and culture. Although, in my opinion, most missionaries today don't think that the Papuan people are unintelligent or, lazy, the strain of disrespect for pre-Christian beliefs and traditions is still around. I do know of some missionaries who believe that the Papuans worshipped demons before Christianity came to the island. I mean, if that's not racism, I don't know what is. From this time through the 1960s, most Papuan conversions to Christianity came from mass conversions rather than conversions on an individual scale. These mass conversions even led to new religious movements synchronizing traditional beliefs with Christianity while modeling behaviors of foreign missionaries. From a history of Christianity in Indonesia, in this period, we also see the emergence of several messianic or salvation movements. The concept of cargo cults explains in an unsatisfactory way the interaction between traditional religious attitudes and Christianity. In a way, these new religious movements form a specific Papuan response to the message of the gospel. These movements may promise immediate and concrete rewards of conversion. However, the churches are doing something similar, enticing Papuans with small gifts like tobacco and betel nuts. It should be noted that, from what I understand, the term cargo cult is considered derogatory and doesn't adequately describe these religious movements. In the 1960s, conversions to Christianity in the Highlands, which is an area of Papua that I lived in for a few years, often took the form of mass conversions. After becoming Christians, some Papuans destroyed their traditional religious symbols, like amulets, holy stones, and masks. Apparently, the missionaries working with these people groups were ambivalent about the destruction of the people's old sacred objects, and I suspect that these missionaries probably encouraged this destruction to a certain degree. By 1969, after a coerced voting scheme, which is an entire thing that I don't have time to explain in this episode, but look it up for yourself, Indonesia had officially taken control of West Papua from the Dutch, and the Indonesian government subsequently took land away from the indigenous peoples, giving it to migrants from other parts of Indonesia. The Indonesian government and military took action to squash any feeling of a separate identity among Papuans, and often used violence as a means of control. It's estimated that over 100,000 Papuans have been killed by the Indonesian army and police since the 1960s. Some Papuans utilize their identities as Christians along with Christian myths to push back against the presence of the Indonesian government and military and their many human rights violations. Today, to my knowledge, many foreign missionaries in the area see the Indonesian government as necessary in Papua and don't view movements for Papuan independence very favorably. So, given Papua's history of colonization and the Papuan experience of marginalization from both the Indonesian government and foreign missionaries, it's really hard for me to get on board with this upcoming documentary about the missionary dentist. In my opinion, this is just one more example of Westerners claiming the roles of main characters in the story of the Papuan people. I mean, is this ego trip like really that necessary? When I talk about Papua, very few people know where Papua is. They usually think I'm talking about PNG. PNG is a separate country, not part of Indonesia. And most people aren't aware of its history or religious tradition. Hell, I lived there and didn't learn much about local Papuan myths or stories, which I'll admit I should have taken the initiative on my own to learn about these things. As its name implies, evangelicalism is about evangelism. Most evangelical churches in the US send out or support missionaries working in all areas of the world. While I'm of the controversial opinion that evangelistic efforts are always unethical, I think that history shows how easily evangelists develop savior complexes. These savior complexes come at the cost of silencing marginalized voices and causing real harm to indigenous communities. So maybe let's stop trying to be the main characters of someone else's story. I wanted to end this video by throwing it over to my bestie Sadam to give her 2 cents about mission work. I think that she has a really interesting and nuanced perspective that's worth making some time for. So, all right, Sadam, take it away.
You mentioned that, and this is a question that I didn't have written down, but you were talking about how, like, seeing how Christianity has impacted Africa through, like, colonialism. What is your opinion about, like, missionary work now? Like, do you have a different opinion of that? And if you don't want to answer this, or if you want to cut it out, we can.
No, that's a great question. And I'm not sure if I'm going to have a very good, I don't know if my answer is going to actually help with anything. So I'm going to try. I'm of 2 minds of it. I think there is a good way to approach it. I think with everything, there's a good way to approach it, but I think the way I have seen it being approached is probably not the most ideal way. My idea is like of missionary work is that, look, there is the Great Commission, and in some ways I do, as much as I do believe in that, and to an extent I would love everyone to know about the gospel, but I think you need to do that in a way that adapts to the prevailing culture that is there and be very respectful of the culture that you are coming to bring the gospel to. And in my opinion, I have not seen that being done in my history. I feel like, the approach is that these people are lost. They don't know anything. Let us come and give the light and all of that sort of thing to it. And I'm like, no, these guys have had an amazing culture that has sustained themselves for thousands, millennia, so many years. You need to respect that, not just bring it in from your particular point of view, because it's not going to work. It's going to fall apart.
Right.
And it's going to look at it's going to look like neocolonialism. It's going to look like you're pursuing an agenda that is not even to do with the gospel. And so I have seen that be respected in the community that I found in Ghana. The pastors that I met very much respected Ghanaian culture, very much respected where the country was at, and really wanted to immerse themselves in it. And I really appreciated that about them. And shout out to you guys are wonderful people. And at the same time, in that same church, I have seen that not work. I have seen other pastors come in from abroad and just assume that they are on another pedestal. And I've seen the whole community kind of fall apart in that way. And so I think you gotta be very, very mindful about the fact that your way is not the highway. You need to adapt it in a way that respects the culture that you're coming into. And I think that's how missionary work will be successful, if they can wrap their heads around that. But as it currently stands, I am not necessarily a fan of, missionary work and how it's being adapted. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that, because I feel like true missionary work, in my opinion, is going and clothing people or feeding people or meeting their needs, physically, tangibly.
To your point about I think missionary work should be there to serve the community. I think that's probably why I really liked the missionary companies that like the missionary groups that were actually doing something, I guess, for the community and serving them in a positive way, than just like the ones that were straight out just going out translating the Bible and then sitting in that what's it called, that village for God knows how long, under the guise of like evangelicalism. Like I fucked with like the pilots, like like all of them. Like I liked that because I was like, they're actually doing something. Like I can see them actually helping. They're bringing medicine and food and evacuating people and doing actual stuff that is helping the community, as opposed to just like, Chale, here's the Bible, read and enjoy. Like, like, I mean, like, translating is all
I
good
totally
for,
agree.
So, like, I think I personally liked those sort of groups a bit more. But yeah, I do find that interesting. Like, I didn't really, like, we didn't really learn that much about, like, the ethnic groups that were around us. And I think that was a bit of a disservice. I'm still learning stuff. Even today, and I don't live anywhere close. Oh no, I do. Somewhat close, but
I feel like I've learned more since I've left, which maybe is like really bad. Like that's really sad. But like just like thinking back to it, just optics wise, like if you think about like we had our missionary kids school up on this hill that like overlooked the rest of the town. And then there was this like other hill that had like another big missionary complex that was like really nice, and like a bunch of missionaries built these like big old houses on top of the hill. Like just optics wise, that's not a good look. Like you literally have like a cabin on a hill and you're like looking down on the people. Like what the fuck?
Like right on the money. Like it doesn't look like we're actually coming to serve the community. We're coming to set ourselves apart from the community, and then we grace you with our presence every time we come down from the hill. Like what? No, please. Like I think I understand for safety reasons. I understand maybe for space. Okay, fine, but like I think you could still be very safe while being amongst the community. And all that sort of stuff. Like even the ones that were like, I guess, like in the community, that they weren't necessarily living on a hill. It was a gated community that these guys lived in. And I think you could only count on like maybe one hand or two the amount of families that actually lived in the town, like properly lived in the town that was below us. It wasn't a great look. The views were nice though. Like, it wasn't a great look.
Those views were great. They were great views. But, I mean, I have no idea what the reasoning was for why, like, all of the missionary complexes, like, were up on a hill. I have no idea. But just, like, looking back at it, I'm like, that's not, like, a great look. Or, like, the missionaries that would go into the smaller villages and their missionary house would be, like, giant. It would be like the biggest house in the village. It's like
why do you need that space?
It's just like rubbing me the wrong way.
Like why do you need that space?
They want like I understand they have maybe their like things that they're used to, like they're used to certain house sizes because a lot of them come from America, but it's not good optics wise. But anyways, I didn't mean to like get down this rabbit hole of like the missionary community.
Oh good.
Thank you all for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons who help make these videos possible. If you like this video, please be sure to subscribe and ring the bell. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my Instagram is Taylor_the_antibot. And if you'd like to consider supporting this channel financially, a link to my Patreon will be down in the description, and we'll see you on the next one. Say bye! He looks extra grumpy today.